Good morning. Thank you for that introduction. So we have about 25 minutes together this morning, and thank you for making the time. That was a lot on an introduction on myself. I don't know how many of you here know about Interexion. Could I just have a quick show of hands of who has heard of Interexion? Okay, thank you for that. We're obviously sandwiched at this session between Facebook and Microsoft, two incredible brands which are very well known. And Interexion, we're actually one of Europe's largest data center providers. We have 34 data centers across 11 countries in Europe, and we've been operating since 1998. Interestingly, from the poll of response there, though, our brand is not perhaps as well known as Facebook and Microsoft. But less of that. That was probably all I'll be mentioning about our company, because what I want to do is take this time this morning to really go through and think about what data centers will do and the role they will drive in the cities of tomorrow. To start, somewhat pretentiously, I've started with a couple of quotes here. If we think back in 1777, Samuel Johnson was famed for saying, "If a man grows tired of London, he grows tired of life." I think if he was to fast forward 237 years today and walk around the city of London, he would still be quite enthralled with what the city has to offer. But these two quotes here, starting with a Voltaire quote, history never repeats itself, but man always does. And we live in the myopia of our own mortality. If you've ever been in part of a university or lived in a generationally, we always think that that generation is the bee's knees, is what will always happen and will always be. And I would like to thread these 2 points of philosophy through the talk this morning to perhaps challenge the nature and the very nature of the human condition and how that lands into data centers empowering the cities of the future. So before we get into it, I'd like to take a little bit of a walk down memory lane.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You come into your office, grab a cup of coffee,
Morning, Chris.
and a Xerox machine presents your morning mail on a screen.
What's the mail this morning? This one looks interesting. Let's take a look at this. I'm going to need a couple of copies of this.
Push a button, and the words and images you see on the screen appear on paper.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Fred. But I think everybody on the routing list should see this.
Push another button, and the information is sent electronically to similar units around the corner or around the world. This is an experimental office system. It's in use now at the Xerox Research Center in Palo Alto, California. Soon, Xerox systems like this will help you manage your most precious resource, information.
Anything else? Flowers. Well, what flowers? My anniversary. I forgot.
So quite an amusing start. That was a commercial ad that was run by Xerox in the mid-1970s. And to think that was only the mid-1970s, within perhaps some or most of our lifetimes here, painting, and that was only in the research center. So it was a view of what the world might be like. I'm obviously followed in a minute by Microsoft, which put a PC on everybody's home and everybody's desktop within 10 to 15 years of this, where this reality became true. If we further dive into technology and the pace of adoption, this chart here shows that from about the 1820s to today, the pace of technology innovation against different categories. So from the first photograph in 1826 and the first telephone in 1877, we see the rate of innovation from the 1970s onwards impacting many of those categories today. So if we only think about the mobile phones we carry, the SIP-based applications we get, Wi-Fi, Skype, all that video internet calling, a lot of that's happened since the 1970s, where we had obviously the click, 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 touch dial phone telephones. So one thing for us really to consider is how much of this pace of change is taking place. And when we look forward to what might be in 20 years' time, what will our world look like, and how will this innovation be landed into our daily lives? Of course, we have great technology battles as we go through this. We all know the Betamax VHS, that's a classic one. RCA fought the battle with the great David Sarnoff for FM versus AM radio, a less well understood technology battle back in the 1930s, but a very valuable one. And of course, a lot of this story links into patenting as well. But notwithstanding that, understanding this pace of adoption is really critical. And the final point to make on this is we've all seen the acquisition of Facebook of WhatsApp, obviously preceded by Facebook this morning. I saw a chart on Facebook, I think, one of my friends put it up the other day, and it showed that the technology adoption of WhatsApp in a 4-year period got to 375 million users within 4 years. Facebook, on the other hand, within its first 4 years, it got up to less than 80 million users. So what we're seeing is this rapid viral adoption of technology across many areas of the TMT landscape, and how that technology is diffusing into our everyday lives. A slightly secondary point to make is this notion of the megacity. This is Frost and Sullivan's view of megacities, which today we reckon, or by 2025, they estimate that there will be 30 megacities globally. Of a megacity is defined as a population of more than 10 million people. And what Frost and Sullivan has shown is that 55% of the estimated megacities will be from the BRIC countries, the developing countries. And for those megacities, they estimate that their GDP growth, the compound growth from today to 2025, will be about 4.4%, compared to megacities within the developed world of about 1.6%. So this trend of urbanization is with us today. More than 50% of the global population now lives in a metropolitan area since about 2010. And that's estimated to be about 60% of the global population by 2025. So as Samuel Johnson is walking around London today, he may well be very impressed in seeing reports, I think even last night, of Sir Norman Foster talking about sky cycle across the streets of London. But how will London, one of the only 2 European megacities forecast here, continue to remain a vibrant and technology innovative city? So to that point, let's have a little look at how the world will start.
It's lots of things. All waking up. Becoming part of the global phenomenon we call the Internet of Everything. The trees will talk to networks, will talk to scientists about climate change. Cars will talk to road sensors, will talk to stoplights about traffic efficiency. The ambulance will talk to patient records, will talk to doctors about saving lives. It's going to be amazing and exciting, and maybe, most remarkably, it's not that far away. The next big thing, we're going to wake the world up and watch with eyes wide as it gets to work. Cisco Tomorrow starts here.
So clearly courtesy of our colleagues at Cisco, and if there's anyone in the Cisco audience today, thank you for the reuse of that, a publicly available advert, which some of us may already have seen. But I think it's a fantastic visionary look at how our lives are going to intertwine between cities and technologies, and what the Internet of Everything, as Cisco describes it, will actually drive in our lives. 3 points to make on the Internet of Everything. I think some of these statistics we may again be familiar with. Gartner talks about 50 billion Internet devices connected, or things connected to the Internet by 2020. Effectively showing that in 2008 there was more things connected to the Internet, exceeded the number of people on Earth. And so we're seeing this trend where machine-to-machine and device connectivity and the growth, therefore, of data is absolutely here, real and present, and on an exponential growth trajectory. One anecdote is the notion and the story of the 200 megabit cow. A Dutch company called Sparked has developed a wireless sensor that attaches and monitors cows. It tells the farmer by an alert when the cow is pregnant or ill, and each cow is thought to generate about 200 megabit of data per annum. So you think of the number of cows for one application, for one farmer to monitor his cattle, and you can only but think potentially how the Internet of Everything will drive data growth and impact lifestyle and services in so many ways. And the final point was some research done recently by Oxford University that has claimed that 47% of today's jobs will be automated in 20 years' time. That's particularly scary. I think you could perhaps see me as a hologram in the future, far better looking perhaps, presenting to you far more eloquently, computer programmed, taking you through this story than the foibles of the human standing before you today. Ray Kurzweil, the great thought leader and future visionary from Google, head of AI, believes that computers will be smarter at predicting human behavior and outsmart humans by 2029. So there's a lot of momentum and thought around this pace of adoption that we're seeing, around this connectivity of everything, around the advances in computing, and how that is dovetailing with this trend of urbanization and the growth of Internet of Things. But if we think back to how will this happen? How is infrastructure effectively aligned to enable this incredible growth to happen? Obviously, we rely on capital markets for funding, and that's presumably that's the subject of another debate and another talk. But if we look to history, we can see this interesting anecdote back from the 1850s. In 1850, the Industrial Revolution propelled England to being the second largest economy globally. And within that, Glasgow was considered to be the fourth largest city, domestic GDP in Europe, behind London, Paris, and Rome. So this isn't a party political broadcast for the Scottish, as for any Brits in the audience today, with my carrying the heritage of McVey as a surname. But what's interesting to learn from this is how did this happen? Why did Glasgow become this incredibly dominant economic force within Europe at that time? And there's three real reasons. One of the first reasons was the Battle of Trafalgar, 1805. In winning that battle, the Brits effectively secured the seas, and it secured the seas for free trade and trade globally. The second phenomena was effectively the Glasgow River Authority in 1809 had enough foresight to realize that it needed to dig deep the River Clyde. That meant ocean-going vessels in the sea could effectively travel down the River Clyde to reach the then developing power and textile factories at Broomlea at the end of the Clyde. And the third part, effectively, was this growth in the textile industry and how Glasgow championed this. And this happened by taking initially skilled hand workers of textile manufacturing from the 1750s, developing power looms or water power generated looms from the tributaries running off of the Clyde, and then how the engineering companies developed around the River Clyde with the advent of steam power from the late 1700s and the beginning of the 1800s. That advent of steam power then gave rise to a whole metallurgy and engineering community within Glasgow, and that then in turn developed the coal industry. And so we saw this domino and network and community effect that effectively brought Clyde and Glasgow together as a very strong, dominant force in the world at that time. If we were to paint an analogy today, what might the global seas be? Well, that's potentially the global internet carriers. The River Clyde, I would postulate in this metaphor, is the local loop provider. And the mills are the data centers of the future. So when we go to look at the past, predicting the future, and the notion that history doesn't repeat itself, but man always does, I like to think of this symbiotic relationship, this dance, this marriage between telecoms and IT. And effectively, I call it the bull and the bird. The bull represents unlimited bandwidth, as much as you can eat, cheap, free, and pervasive everywhere globally. And the bird is therefore the IT systems that sit upon that bandwidth and the IT and technology that we can consume. Very interestingly and very timely, we've seen this week announcements from the US that Netflix, an incredible consumer offering, of which I was only watching a Netflix movie last night, is today about 30% of internet traffic in the US. we're starting to see some challenges with certain US backhaul providers and local loop providers playing both roles, impeding potentially Netflix performance in terms of how the backhaul to the local loop is working. So this interplay and this history lesson, obviously for many of us who've been around since the 1990s, and we saw the ASP model of the telcos. That was the telcos' view and vision of running applications as a service, which is cloud today, running them, but it was the local loop that ultimately was the prohibitor of that. So when we look to effective demand, this is a chart here that shows the red bar, ignore the title please, but the red bar shows the impact of big data on international bandwidth, forecast in terabits per second, and then the blue bar shows the international bandwidth demand excluding big data. And we've estimated that up to 25% more bandwidth will be required because of the impact of big data. And the way we've built this model was built by using what's called the Bass diffusion model, which looks at S-curve penetration. Professor Frank Bass from the University of Texas years ago. But if we go back to the opening gamut around technology diffusion and the pace of diffusion, I would suggest that we've been very conservative on this, on the basis of that diffusion and time frame for diffusion, in terms of how we're seeing technology go viral. So what we're seeing, therefore, is that big data's impact on networks effectively could add up to 25 to 30% on the demand of international network capacity. Now, of course, we all sit here in the audience saying, yes, but the amount of unlit fiber is still huge, and it's just a matter of lighting that fiber up. But I think the anecdote to share in terms of what we're seeing commercially in the United States particularly, and the impact of Netflix, is that the fighting for corporates for business IP versus consumer IP, where I think the Cisco CNI report says 45% of consumer traffic, IP traffic will be video on demand. That is a battle because it's all ultimately running over the same pipes. The second point to make as a resource is power. So when we applied this same model to the power supply, again, we see about a 20% uplift on the power demands that data center draws. I think today data centers take about 14% of business energy globally. We expect that to go up to nearly 20% by 2016. So access to power, again, it's the subject of another talk specifically, is absolutely key. Something we consider a utility and a commodity today, actually without it is potentially a very strategic asset. So just to go into that a little bit more detail, what has Interexion done in the basis of power? In Stockholm, we have a data center case study here where, if we look on the left, the project we did was seawater cooling, where effectively we took, working with a partner, Fortrum, we used the seawater availability around the data center and the town of Stockholm to cool our data centers. But what we did that was slightly different was we passed that water through 2 data centers twice. And in doing that, we effectively saw our PUE originally go from 1.95 down to 1.09. We saved nearly 80% of our data center energy costs. And we believe what we did was increase our energy efficiency by up to 13% by the very fact that we passed the seawater cooling through twice. So where does all this lead us to? We've seen some trends in technology and pace of adoption. We've seen an exciting picture in terms of the city of tomorrow and how our lives are increasingly being urbanized and how that intersects in that urbanization with technology and with trends. We've seen that potentially history may repeat itself, and that in so doing, what we consider to be commodity may actually be a scarce resource, and having access to that scarce resource is very, very key. And we've seen that from history, it shows us that when a seismic shift happens, like the Industrial Revolution, some of the attributes of that shift happen on the basis of community and that community forming together. And Interexion, we're at what's called a carrier and cloud neutral data center. So our whole raison d'etre is we build a building, we make sure it has access to power, access to bandwidth with over 450 carriers across Europe, but then in so doing, we foster a community environment. So we're neutral to telcos, IT service providers. We are home to suppliers and buyers of IT. And effectively, we run both public clouds, private clouds, traditional dedicated bare metal server deployments on behalf of our customers. And we believe all of this community coming together, from the supply side to the buy side, from the infrastructure providers and the cloud providers, enables a community to foster, transact, integrate, and create value to grow. So at that point, I think I'll leave you today and say thank you for your time. I think what we've seen in summary is potentially an incredible trend of urbanization, an amazing, exciting rate of technology adoption, a look at history in terms of how industrial revolutions require certain attributes to enable that seismic shift, and then positioning data centers within that to be the enablers of the future, particularly around access to what might be perceived commodity today, which may be scarce resource tomorrow, whether that's bandwidth or power, but most notably, the formation of a community of interest. So with that, I thank you.